Did you know Ken Anderson?
Yeah,
What was he
yeah.
like? What kind of a guy was he?
He was a fun guy. He was very always nice to me. Talented guy. He had studied architecture, and I don't know how he ended up in the cartoon business because he had gone to school to become an architect. Somehow he ended up at Disney and ended up, I think designing. I think he was a layout guy because of his architectural background. Then he got into story, and then he ended his career as a conceptualist. Basically, he'd be the guy to kick off a new project. He would come up with characters and environments and art styles, and
A biz dev guy? Is
yeah. Today it's probably known as visual development. So that's what Ken did. But he was a good guy. He worshipped Walt, and too much so.
Oh.
I mean, I admired Walt not that much. I mean, it was the kind of thing, and being younger and maybe being able to observe all this, and this was part of being a kid here at Disney, was getting a chance to observe everything. I noticed that these guys took their work so seriously, and if Walt loved what you did, you would be elated. It was like the
right.
greatest day of your life.
Yes.
And if he didn't like what you did, you would be devastated. And poor Ken, a number of times, I think was just devastated by when something he had done did not find favor with Walt. And I remember one project, I think this was in the 1960s, where Walt Disney turned thumbs down on a project. And Ken had a stroke a few days later, and I can't help but think that was related to that terrible, I don't know, call it terrible blow. It's like you think, my God, these guys really take this stuff seriously. And we thought Ken was never coming back because he had a stroke. He had lost the ability to draw, and we thought, man, it's over. His career is over. But believe it or not, he made his way back until he regained his health. He regained his ability to draw and paint again, and so he made a complete recovery. But he was a nice guy. He was kind of like a big kid in a way. I remember I still see him now. He with the crew haircut, and he had large eyes and the big eyes, and the enthusiasm he had for this place and for Disney. And in many ways, I think that, like a lot of the old guys, I think retirement, in a way, killed them. I think Disney was such a part of their life that when they no longer came to work every day, it's part of why I come to work every day,
Right.
so I won't die. A lot of these guys, when they finally ended their distinguished career, they seemed to go home and die. Very few of them seemed to survive retirement for very long. If you kept busy, that was different. Frank and Ollie, when they retired, they went out and started doing a series of books on animation, and they stayed busy, they stayed active, they lectured, they traveled the world, regaled as animation legends, and I think that kept them alive. It really did. The guys who just put down their pencil, put down their paintbrush, they seemed to just go home and die. And I used to have a macabre joke that once you retired, you had about 2 years of life left, because I had begun to time it. I'd see an old artist retire from Disney. He would retire, he would move to Santa Barbara, and 2 years later he'd be dead. I remember when Eric Larson, who was active here, even after he stopped animating, he was active with teaching the young kids. He had kind of a training program. Why Disney decided to discontinue that, I don't know. But to me, it was tragic because Eric was, he was a Disney legend, and he taught all the young kids. They gave him a big office. And then one day the studio decided Eric had contributed enough, and he was retired, sent home. And I remember telling people, I said,
2 years.
2 years. I give him 2 years. Pretty much 2 years later, Eric was gone because he had nothing to do. He was no longer working. He was no longer teaching. He was no longer contributing. And when you're no longer doing something, you say, "Gosh, my life is over." And one day you just don't wake up. And I think that's the tragedy of retiring sometimes. It can be a a death sentence.
Yes.
Literally a death sentence. Being aware of this, I'm always active.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
always busy. If I don't have a job, then I'll make one. I stay busy because I know if I'm not busy, then I'm essentially dead anyway.
Yes,
You know?
I know what you mean.
Yeah, you can't do that. Yeah,
Right.
you can't call it quits.
You know what, you talk about Walt Paraguay was interesting. Were there any other characters who were as striking or strong or crazy in their way as he was?
Yeah, I guess it's the ones who were like this who stand out. Most were not. Most guys, and the women too, would just come to work and do their job. And it's only the crazy ones you remember.
What was Al
Because-
Dempster like?
Well, see, Al was one of these guys who was just very nice gentleman, talented, but never made any waves, never pushed back at Walt. Walt would say, Al, I want this. That's what Al gave him. And so he's very laid back, very mellow, very cool. And I remember when I told Ann Guenther, who's a background artist, who's also retired now. I haven't seen Annie in a few years, but I remember when Ann was unemployed and she was looking for work, and I said, Ann, you should go to Disney and talk to Al Dempster. And she said, oh, no, Disney is kind of like, the pinnacle of animation art. And Al Dempster is kind of this legendary Disney artist. He would never talk to me. And I said, Ann, Al's a nice guy. I said, make an appointment and show him your work. And luckily she did, and she was hired. Al hired her, and she worked here for years. And in recent years, she's actually been teaching a lot of the young background artists over at Disney Animation how to paint, because she's sharing the things she's learned from the old Disney guys. Yeah. More should be known about Ann Guenther. She's, again, like we talk about Thelma Witner. I don't know a lot about Thelma because, again, she was not a contemporary. She was older. Once I was the kid, so you just, we're different age groups, so you don't tend to talk to people who are older than you. You don't always relate. So I certainly knew Thelma. She was right down the hall from me when I was on the second floor. So I was aware of her talent and her skill and the fact that she looked like a librarian. But I don't know that much about her. I only know Ann Guenther because she was more my age, and we worked together on many projects at different studios. And then I got to know about her background, and that, like, she was like the daughter of a coal miner, and she comes all the way to California. This incredibly naive little girl who was so naive she was hitchhiking to work here in LA when she was like 17 or 18 years old. And I thought, my God,
Yeah.
she came here with just such an innocence, and started out in the ink and paint department, tracing cells and painting cells, and moved all the way from that lowly position to being just this incredible background artist. But that's the opportunities that were available for people who were willing to put in the time and work hard and learn. The sky was the limit, male or female.
Right.
Now, I will admit that it was not easy for women. Very definitely not easy, because it was a man's world back in the 50s.
Okay, tell me about that, because Mary Blair, another thing is that she was a female artist in a man's world, and I've heard that she might have been kind of embattled because of that, but I don't know, but I hear
So much, it's true, so much so
Yeah.
that I had a chapter in my book entitled Man's World, and Disney Legal said, we're uncomfortable with that chapter. They didn't say take it out. They were saying that chapter makes us uncomfortable. I said, I'll bet it does, because it's true. So I said, look, I'm not going to cut the chapter. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll change the chapter title. So I removed Man's World and called it A Mistaken Notion. That mistaken notion being, a lot of people thought that men did all the work, and I said there were a lot of women. And I couldn't name every woman because there would be a whole chapter of just names, but I did name a number of women who played a major role at Disney. Even during that period when animation was very much a man's world, but certain women were able to incredibly so. I don't know how they did it, break through. Retta Scott was an animator on
Yes.
Bambi in the 40s. How she did that, I'll never know.
I heard that the reason that happened was that so many animators were drafted
because
for
of
the war.
Exactly, because of
Yeah.
the war. That's right.
So they just said she was like a Rosie the Riveter kind of in the that's what she was.
Very true, very
Yeah.
true. Had it not been for the war, chances are
She would have stayed at Ink and Paint.
that's right, that would not have happened. Retta Davidson also, I think, got promoted up the ladder because of the war. So many of the men had gone off to join the military. So, but it's funny, even after those opportunities for women happened in the 40s, once the war was over, once we were into the 50s, women were relegated back to the usual positions. Now things didn't change entirely, because what had happened by the 50s, a number of women had made it out of ink and paint into animation, where they worked as assistant animators, as in-betweeners, breakdown artists, assistant animators, and key assistants. So women were beginning to have an opportunity in animation. Once again, because there was a real need. Now, we were doing Sleeping Beauty in the 1950s, and that film was a real challenge. Keep in mind, everything was still drawn by hand, and you had to have people who could draw really well and have almost this delicate touch, because the drawings were so exquisite. Not every man could do that kind of work. A few could. We had a few who had that delicate touch. So they brought more women in to work in animation, because they had to do these beautiful drawings. And I named the names, Mary Anderson and Doris Collins and Fran Marr, Sylvia Naide, Sylvia Fry, and the name goes on. I'm trying to think of names all the way back to the 1950s. And I did name a number of them. And I said, women were suddenly allowed into the man's world because they were really, they were needed. One woman that I wrote about, she was not in this current book, but I hope maybe a future book, was a woman named Elizabeth Case, who was really interesting because her father had been a famous radio announcer, Nelson Case, and Elizabeth came to Disney because she wanted to be an artist, and she really loved it here, and she was really a free spirit. Keep in mind, she kind of like led the whole hippie movement. So when she left Disney, she actually moved to San Francisco and began to read poetry in coffee houses. She was part of that whole movement that began in the 60s with that whole change. She was in, she read poetry at City Lights bookstore, North Beach in San Francisco. Part of that 60s scene of this whole counterculture. Well, she started that here at Disney when she was wearing black leotard to work, and everybody was looking at her like, who's this crazy woman? Why does she dress in such an odd manner? Well, that style of dress that Liz was dressing, that became the whole thing a decade later with the poetry readings and the coffee houses and that whole movement. Jack Kerouac and Ferlinghetti. So the whole Beat generation, I watched all of that start here at Disney. Yeah. She really was. So like I said, the women in this industry have just been fascinating.